Thanks for joining us and subscribing and listening to the Clive Barker podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the imagination of Clive Barker. In this episode 193, Jose and Ryan, that's me, we talk about Clive's 1998 novel Galilee. This episode is sponsored by HorrorMarketplace.com. Visit their Etsy site for cool horror-themed enamel pins and t-shirts. Well, thanks again for joining us. This is episode 193, and we've finally gotten to Galilee.
Yeah, or like Clive Barker called it early when he was writing it, and you can read this in the revelatory interview number 2, when Phil and Sarah asked him, did you ever call it something else before you called it Galilee? And he said, Galilee was originally the Holy Family, which is now one of the part titles of the book. And he wrote it back when the editor at HarperCollins was John Silbersack. So the Holy Family, which I think is one of the title for one of the chapters in the book.
That's interesting. You know, actually that would make a good overall title for the trilogy. You know, it would be part 1 Galilee. Of course, probably the whole thing is about Galilee, so who knows? But
I think over the years, Clive mentioned that this book was going to have at least a second parter, but I'm not sure if he ever planned to have it turn into a trilogy. But definitely
there's a note here that you had put in here at the bottom, where he said, in replies to questions on Facebook Q&A session 15, December 2012, he said the same is true of the second and last volume of Galilee.
Right.
Yeah. So, talking about his plans after he finished Abarat, then it would be the third book of the art and the second and last volumes of Galilee.
Yeah, but we were going to have Marcus join us for this episode. Unfortunately, he had to work today, and he hadn't had enough time to finish the book. It's a dense book, right? I mean, it's kind of a dense book. There's a lot of subplots and stories and family trees to keep track of. Yeah. And my edition of the book had the family tree of both the Giris and the Barbarossas, which are the two families that are going to be part of this book.
Yeah. So, and I had remembered seeing that before, but I didn't know where I'd seen that before until you posted it up on Facebook.
Yeah, my little paperback has that. So
is that what it is? Something added in, like for a later edition, then?
I don't think so. I think this might have come out at least in the English editions, the British ones.
Well, the U.S. I have the U.S. first edition, and it doesn't have that. And I have the.
Okay.
And I have the special edition, the cloth bound with the tray case and all that, and it doesn't have it either.
That's so weird because that's such a, I think, helpful.
It is really helpful.
Addendum to the story, just like when Great and Secret Show came out, and the British editions had and international editions had the medallion, the Shoal medallion drawing that he did. I mean, you need that to visualize when eventually the Jaff and Fletcher and all that stuff talk about the medallion and what it means. It's nice to have that visual aid to see like the monkey from the fish and then the metacosm, and same for this. I mean, this is a very, very complex couple of families, and so it's nice to have this family tree.
And this time around, I listened to the audio book, and as I was listening, I would hear about Kitty, and I was like, okay, wait, which one is Kitty? Oh, that's Catherine. That was Cadmus's first wife before Loretta. Okay, got it. And it is hard to keep track of, particularly the Giri family tree, but also with the Barbarossas, it's like, okay, which ones of them are gods and which ones are demigods?
Right. Yeah. Interesting, because Giri family tree, of course, is longer than the Barbarossa just because human life has a shorter span, and so we have more generations added to it. Where it seemed like the Barbarossa family is kind of stuck in time, right? It's like they kind of got stuck somewhere along the line after Nicodemus. So let's start at the beginning, I guess. So the novel is called Galilee. It was supposed to be the Holy Family, and it opens with It's the first book that Clive ever wrote that has a first-person narrator, right?
Yeah, and that for me was hard because I just because I have pretty bad ADHD and I have
Mm.
trouble reading large blocks of text. I really need it a lot of times to be broken up with dialogue. So first person and like epistolary novels and stuff like that are really hard for me to focus on. And so at the beginning I had trouble with this book, but Clive found sort of a MacGuffin, a sort of a way to take a first person narrative and make it omniscient, which you don't usually see. And it's interesting. And it involves a dome, like the dome in Sacrament, the Domus
Right.
Mundi. Yeah.
Yeah, the Domus Mundi, which is actually mean the house of the world.
Yeah.
But interesting because that dome is from the house that the Barbarossas live in that was built by Thomas Jefferson,
Yeah.
who we'll get to that. But I recommend people go and look up the pages on Jeffersonian architecture because they're really fascinating stuff to get into. And you can see how Jefferson had this fascination for Palladian architecture, and then the octagon is something that was important for him. Building a house that has like 8 sides and stuff like that, and even there's something I need to add to the show notes here. There's a document of Thomas Jefferson himself drawing an octagon and teaching people how to actually make an octagon. Like you have to make a semicircle and then you have to like intersect it, bisect it, and then you make another circle, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's really fascinating stuff because he was a polymath, right? I mean, it seems like Jefferson, as one of the founding fathers, he got to be a founding father of the United States through his own merit of his own genius, because it seems like the more I read about Thomas Jefferson, the more I see that he was really one of those people who never really standing still, right? He's always thinking about something. He was a big philosophical thinker and, kind of an ambiguous character in certain ways politically, but a man who actually understood the pursuit of happiness and how a country, he looked at America and saw a country there and, saw freedom. So I think that comes from the genius of Jefferson, that he was an illuminated man. I mean, he's clearly influenced by a lot of enlightened ideas of the time.
Well, and you kind of wonder if Clive Barker may have had a tour of the Jefferson House.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he does mention in interviews that he researched a lot about the Civil War. He went to Bentonville, and at one point he was writing a little bit of the notes for this novel in a house that had been turned into a hospital for the Civil War casualties. So, yeah.
Right, and that's just about the only horrific part in the whole novel is going back to that Civil War, that house that had been converted to the Civil War hospital.
Mm-hmm. So the opening of the book, part 1, has kind of a foreboding title, right? It's called "The Time Remaining," which makes it seem like there's a ticking clock.
Yeah, and that's something that doesn't pay off in this book. It's something that's sort of saved for later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The introductory chapter is always a bit clunky because it has to provide enough exposition to allow us to connect with the characters and the situation that they're going to tackle, and little enough information to keep us going on and avoid throwing us, like you mentioned, walls of text about each character. I thought there was a good balance for this book. Sometimes it feels a little too much. The narrator does make you wonder at this point, though, if this is his own biography that he's going to write, because he goes on a bit about himself, his own life, how he got himself in this situation, stuck in the house.
Yeah,
and
Edmund Maddox.
Yeah, Edmund Maddox Barbarossa.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting because he's we find out that he's a demigod. He's really frank about it. He's not cagey at all. He's just kind of, he doesn't really know his stepmother that well, but she lets him live in the house. He hasn't seen her in a few years. He's crippled, and we'll find out later why that is. He's in a wheelchair,
Right.
and he's decided that he wants to start writing a book, which is what he's basically is what we're reading is his book.
Yeah. So Maddox lives in this house called L'Enfant, which used to be called L'Enfant des Carolinas, which means the child of the Carolinas. Is this supposed to be in South Carolina?
Yeah,
I forgot.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so he lives in that house with at least 3 women, which, like you mentioned, his stepmother, Cesaria. I'm going to call her Cesaria because I know we had a short dialogue about this, I think, in the last episode where you said you were listening to the audiobook, and in it, the man who reads the book calls her Cesaria.
Yeah, Cesaria.
That sounds off to me. I'm going to go with Cesaria. So Cesaria, and then his half-sister Marietta and his half-sister Zabrina.
Yeah.
And then 2 men live in this house as well. One is his half-brother Lumen, who's kind of a wild man, like a John the Baptist kind of character, and Dwight Hoodie, who's the major domo of L'Enfant.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an enormous house, 34,000 square feet at one point, it's mentioned. And Ryan, has any opinion on the square footage as a former realtor? Any idea of something comparable in your experience?
I've been in a house that was 10,000 square feet.
Wow.
And it was a kind of
in Alaska?
Yes, and it was kind of a big labyrinth, but yeah, 34,000 square feet. That's huge. That's like an arena.
Right. Yeah. That would be enormous. I mean, I've been to the Winchester Mystery House, and of course that one seems to be even bigger. But yeah, I can't imagine 34,000. My house has about 1,700 square feet.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So it's kind of big for a condo. So, but I'm trying to imagine 30 of those.
25,000 square feet is about a square mile.
Okay. Let me just look really quickly. What's the square footage of the White House? I'm just curious. I'm going to ask a really dumb question, but who built the White House? Do you know?
No. No, I don't. I had heard that it was built by slaves, but I have no idea if that's true or not.
Right. I meant the architect. Oh, the White House has 55,000 square feet.
Okay.
Damn, that is enormous.
Yeah, that's huge. I've walked past it, but I never did a tour or went inside.
Let me see who is the architect of the White House. James Hoban. Okay. Probably a contemporaneous with Jefferson, I guess. Yeah. So, right. So, Caesarea Nicodemus. So Nicodemus, much like the father of what's the name of the villain in Abarat? I forgot his name. The guy with the collar.
Oh yeah, Christopher Carrion.
Christopher Carrion, right? So, in some ways, much like the father of Christopher Carrion, Nicodemus has been dead for 140 years, and he died in like this stormy night, and people still think he's going to come back at some point. Yeah. And like in Abarat, Christopher Carrion's dad died also in one night that nobody talks about, where there was an enormous fire and their castle burned down.
And the orchard burned, yeah.
And his body was never found. So in this case, Nicodemus died 140 years ago, but his body not only was found, but is buried in the stables.
But so, for somebody like him who's a god and nobody knows where he came from or if he was born or when, death doesn't necessarily mean much. I mean, he could just be hiding out somewhere. His spirit is hiding somewhere, and
so so it's kind of a meta thing that Clive does here, because he's talking about a guy who's starting to write a book, and while he himself is writing the book of a guy writing a book. Yeah. So there is that kind of strange thing that you can't help but think are there any autobiographical things that Clive put into this one?
Yeah.
And he did. He did put some stuff into it. He's mentioned in interviews at the time he was still kind of having a friendship relationship, maybe more than that, with Dodds, John Dodds, I believe, who was a former nurse that worked with AIDS patients, I believe, and he met him after he left John Gregson, who Clive has mentioned in some interviews that was not really the best partner that he had. It was a little abusive at sometimes, especially when Clive wanted to move to the United States and they kind of broke up. But then Dodds was kind of Clive Barker's assistant / partner. And he does have a acknowledgement here in the book about John Dodds. So even though the book is dedicated to David Emilion Armstrong, who was, of course, at the time Clive's husband, and no longer, but
there's after that page, there's a long page of special thanks, after the dedication, which includes, right, like you said, David John Dodds, and he's got Don. There's a whole bunch of people that worked for him back in those days that aren't there anymore.
Right. Apparently, the early Seraphin was run by Anna Miller, who, along with Rob Humphreys and a guy called Joe, ran the film production company. Of course, Joe Daly, who I don't know a lot about, but I guess we'll eventually find out more about him at some point. And like you said, he did visit North Carolina with Van Sauls of McGee's Crossroads. He explored the Carolinas with him and got some insights from this guy. And conversations wandering the midnight streets of Charleston and the woods at Bentonville, where the armies of North and South clashed so calamitously. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things here. And but there are parts of this story that are based on biographical stuff. Like the point I was going to make was that, for example, when in the chapter, The Immortal Family, when Galilee is being baptized, he escapes his parents and jumps into the sea and swims, who knows how long, but then of course Nicodemus dives back into the ocean and grabs his escaping child. And this was based off an episode where David once escaped his parents when he was a toddler. So that's one of the things that you find out when you do research about this and read all these interviews, that was based on a little chapter of David's life when he himself escaped his parents when he was a toddler. So there's stuff like that. Yeah, there was stuff like that in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, there's sort of this interesting romanticizing of that Clive has done in a few books of a black man, like making them sort of divine. I'm thinking of like
Piopa,
yeah, Joe Flicker a little bit, in the second book of the art.
But they're always they're always magical and special and romantic characters, but they're also a little bit tragic, and they're also kind of enslaved to like either their lover or some sort of family or something. And that's the case as well with Galilee. He's a man who, at his heart, I believe he's meant to embody freedom. But at the same time, he's shackled in this kind of promise that he did. And we'll get to that later in the story. But so, yeah, just like Piopa was shackled to the promise that he did to the maestro, John Fury Zacharias, that he would go on into the world as a whore or an assassin. And in this case, Galilee is also held to this promise that was done back after the Civil War times, right?
Yeah. He had this tie tied to the Geary family, which we'll kind of get to, but he also would do things for them, like he murdered someone for them. For Cadmus, he murdered George, right?
Right.
And I don't think they explain why that is. I don't remember that there being an explanation for that. It's a pretty horrific thing to hire an assassin to kill your son.
Right. So I want to make a disclaimer here. You've listened to the audiobook. I tried reading as much as I could from the book. And unfortunately, for my busy schedule of working 7 days a week, I didn't have enough time to completely finish the book. So I'm going to, some of the parts of the story, I'm going to go with what my memory is of them because I've read the book twice. But yeah, it seems to me that Galilee and the whole aura of romance around it has a lot to do with where Clive was relationship-wise. He was very much in love with David at the time. It was a big experience for Clive in terms of getting himself into a relationship that had a lot to do with domestic life, and he always was kind of wary of marriage. And so this was the time when Clive actually did a ceremony, dinner with friends, and then, before God and his friends, they exchanged vows and became married to their own eyes, because at the time California didn't recognize same-sex unions.
Right.
Unfortunately, that relationship ended in early 2009, I think. But for example, other things that you can draw parallels in the story is that Clive used to have a house in Hawaii as well, just like the house that Galilee built in Kauai, I think.
Yeah.
Is that Kauai?
Yeah, in Kauai.
Yeah. Which probably informed the whole description of the island and the house that Galilee lives in. So that's another part there that seems to be a little bit autobiographical from Clive. And he's mentioned in interviews that the Gearys are his family and the Gearys are David's family and the Barbarossas are his family, which I mean, loosely, of course. He did mention that in interviews. So that would make Galilee David and Rachel would be Clive. Even though I see a lot of Clive and Maddox, a lot more of Clive and Maddox, the narrator of the story.
Yes, yeah, right. I mean, I think he puts a little bit of himself into a lot of these characters, which I guess, as a writer you kind of have to. But and I think, the more I read this, I got swept into this. Well, not reading, but I was listening to it this time around. But I got swept into the story. I thought, I wanted to hear what was, what was coming next. I spent a lot of time, doing dishes and driving and stuff, to get through it, through the audiobook. But I think my first time around reading this book, I, like a lot of people, I think that I was disappointed by the fact that it's like, well, here's another news story. When are we going to finish the books of the art?
Yeah. Yeah. I think at this time, Clive was, he had come out of depression, right? He had gone through terrible depression. His cousin had passed away from AIDS, and Clive was going through a lot of, depression at his time. And I think he kind of got out of it by meeting David as well. It's a funny story. I found a book once where it was called Stories About Gay Men, how they met and how they came out of the closet. I forgot the title of the book. I'll have to look it up. But in it was a chapter by David Emilian Armstrong where he said how he came out of the closet, how he got to meet Clive, and got to raise his daughter with Clive and all that stuff. And it's funny because he said that he was in the closet for a long time because he was married. He had a daughter. And one day they were separated, and he went out partying, and he was parking at a club. And all of a sudden Clive comes in with like his blue car and kind of stole his parking spot. And David came out of the car and was like, "Hey, you stole my parking spot." And then he said that as soon as Clive Barker rolled down the window that he was like, "Oh, well, that's okay because you're cute." So and then eventually they struck up a conversation, had an interesting night together. And then Clive so Clive ended up going to David's house that night, and because David said he had a ham in the oven while he was out clubbing, and then when they got home, Clive said something like, "Oh, what's that smell?" He's like, "Well, that's my ham." So yeah. So eventually he said that that's the way that David got himself to be more open about his homosexuality, and and Clive, met his family. And at one point, Clive actually had dinner with his parents, and he told David's dad, "Well, I want to tell you something. You and me and your son, we love each other very much, and we're married. So what do you have to say about that?" And the guy and David's dad apparently said something like, "Well, as long as you guys love each other and take care of each other well, I'm okay with it." And then Clive kind of nudged at David and said, "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said?" And David said that all he could come out with was like, "This is good soup. This is really good soup." And he just kept eating because he was kind of afraid of what his dad would say. But so I bought and read Galilee when it came out. By that time, I was already deep into Clive's works, and I had read Imagica and Sacrament, and I had really loved Imagica and liked Sacrament. So it was 1998. I think the book came out in May or something. I do remember it was the summer of 98, and I bought a paperback of Galilee at a store in Lisbon. It was in the summer when Lisbon was hosting the World Expo 98, so good times. I had some trouble reading the book the first time around. Some of my issues with the book came from the way the story was told, and especially the way the narrator hallucinates all these memories out of thin air. I know it's a strange thing to get hung up in a Clive Barker book about the fantasy part, but it really seemed a bit, I wouldn't say the word contrived, but I would say that it's like, I don't know, the whole section, how he is able to remember things that he wasn't a part of, because he goes up to the house and then he gets filled up with all this information.
Yeah, it's a way of solving the problem that when you're writing in third person, you're omniscient. It's written by God. But when we're a first person, you're limited by their perspective, and it's how do you get out? How do you break out of that? Well, he came up with a sort of a MacGuffin, right? It's a
it's a magic family and a magic house.
Yeah, the dome of L'Enfant is magic. I guess created by Thomas Jefferson, but made that way by Caesarea.
So the Barbarossas are an interesting family. They're pretty dysfunctional. They have all this potential, but they hide from the world. They stay in this old house all the time. Yeah. Like Maddox, who is being part Barbarossa, part human. He's about 140 years old, and they all live on the fringes of society, right? Like Marietta is kind of a hedonist. She's a lesbian, and she reinvents herself all the time. And eventually brings a whole group of lesbians to live in the house at the end of the book.
Yeah.
Or Sabrina, who's she's morbidly obese, and she just sticks to her rooms all the time, and she dotes on, or she kind of helps her mother, on her daily needs.
Yeah, and brings food up to her bedroom and stuff.
Lumen is kind of like this crazy, like, ultimate outcast. He's like a John the Baptist character in the sense that he's not very aware of his physicality. He doesn't care about looks or appearances, so he's always like unkempt. And at one point he says sometimes he lives in this smokehouse on the edges of the property, kind of like a doghouse, really.
Yeah.
And he says sometimes he gets all naked and lets the mosquitoes get at him because it gets him going. And he's kind of a masochist, strange character. Not all there, I think.
Oh, he's also kind of a drunk.
Yeah, and a bit of a lunatic. So they're all seriously broken in some way, despite all their potential. And they're kind of standing still in time as the world passes them by, whereas the Giris are a family of old money and make the world bend to them as the rich family they are. They're not as passive. They're super active in the world. So they've
kind of reached a tipping point where they're the last guard that remembers how they became powerful and why is becoming senile and dying. And
right.
So
Cadmus.
Yeah. So the real sort of one big crux of the story is that these two families are going to come to a head because it's like, they don't remember, the Giris don't remember why they need them anymore, or why are they putting up with this stuff from them?
Yeah. And the Giris are also very broken and dysfunctional, but they make people conform to their dysfunction because they're rich. Yeah. Whereas the Barbarossas just seem to to let their dysfunctionality define them as who they are, but I think things are going to change at the end of the story. So, but where they come from is interesting. At one point in the book, I think it's Rachel, because she's one of the big characters in the book as well. She asks Galilee about his grandparents, and he says, "Well, I never had grandparents," and she's like, "Well, everybody has grandparents. I mean, your parents had to have parents of their own," and she's like, "Nope, they never did."
Yeah.
And going into it, I mean, Nicodemus and Caesarea. Nicodemus has been dead for 140 years, but like many of the other male characters from Clive, he's driven by his maleness almost to the point of cult, right? I mean, in his abandoned, rooms, he has a collection of sex toys. He has idolized representations of penises, almost as small deities. The bringer of life. He had temples made out for him, and he bred and raised horses, which are a symbolic representation of power. Freedom, drive. Associated with a male totem, the stallion represents potency, sexual energy, stamina. So it makes perfect sense that he would have a stable, and that all the horses died within an hour of his passing.
It's also sort of interesting that he's an archetypal male and Caesarea is an archetypal female, kind of like the characters from Sacrament, right? That they're like 100% female and 100% male. Split in two, and so it's like they're dysfunctional on their own.
Nicodemus is kind of he's a man of the here and now, right? He's suspicious of books and reading. He tells Maddox. Maddox recalls when Nicodemus told him, "You don't waste time on books. The only book you should read is Between Women's Legs." And this is a man of profound appetites and a desire to live the world in all its possibilities within every moment. He never looks backwards. He just looks forward. He doesn't take the time to imagine things. In his mysteriously long life, he's not just an observer, but he's a experimenter, right? He experiences everything that's going on, and he's not only a witness of history, but he's a participant of history. He's lived for thousands of years, and it's hinted here that in the book a couple of times that he might have been around at the time of Christ, and he might have met Christ himself. Like you said, he's more of an archetype than reality, and that's, I guess, why time doesn't touch him. So,
and there's a secret temple to him in Washington D.C. that the politicians visit.
Right. The Jefferson built a copy of the temple that Caesarea showed him once. And his death, instead of throwing him into oblivion, actually Nicodemus is still very much present in his life's family and in his family's life. And it still affects his sons and daughters and his widow. His absence in this case seems to have sapped the family of their momentum. Like Nicodemus was the driving force of the family.
That's true. It's like they're all just kind of waiting, aren't they? I mean, they're all just kind of hiding out in their house, not doing anything.
Right. And Caesarea is the other side of the yin yang, right? She's the original mother, like you said. And she's got a sternness that's stoic and a stubbornness that seems to be the only thing that roots her to this world. So she has kindness, but she also has fury. And being a mother, I think that she loves her firstborn most of all, and also resents him for staying a part of her and for betraying her son, Galilee.
Right.
So Galilee in this book, I think he's doubly damned by having his mother's unforgivable love and cursed by his father's physical absence, because being his father's son, his blood boils with Nicodemus's rush, and that keeps him always on the move and gives him this thirst for freedom and unfortunately, like we're going to get into, he has a mysterious contract that robs him of that freedom to the point of suicide.
Which is pretty horrible, and also the fact that he wants to fall in love with Rachel, but then he sort of feels like he can't, and he sabotages it, and I think that also contributes to him trying to kill himself. Which what he does is he goes out into the sea and just kind of lets the boat drift and go into a storm, and
Right, and just has some brandy and some cigars. Anyway, so going back to Maddox, the whole story comes about because his sister, half sister Marietta, kind of pushes him into writing the story. She's the first one that mentions that the time is running out. The opening chapter title, that she has this kind of prophetic skill, and it's not just her. I mean, people like Dwight Hoodie. He also says he's been having dreams that.
Everybody has this sort of uneasy dread or feeling that this is all going to come to an end, but they don't know exactly how or why. It seems like it's tied to the Gearys attacking the house, finding them and attacking the house, but we don't get there.
Yeah. So Maddox wants to write this story, and they don't know if Caesarea is okay with it, but then she actually is. She approves of the book writing, and she tells Maddox to be honest and just say the truth and say it in his own way. And I think maybe she wants the story to be told to understand where this family is coming from and where they're moving to. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems Caesarea feels that the time is running out, and as such, maybe she would like to have the story relived and remembered, and in doing so, maybe bring about some sort of resolution. I like the way that Clive gets us to fall in love with the idea of reading a family history, and at the same time keeps us grounded in the real world of this story as he himself is working on it. I mean, it's because when Maddox is writing the book, he goes back and forth from flashbacks to his daily life at the house. Like, oh, I'm going downstairs. It's middle of the night, but I'm going downstairs to have munchies. And he's opening the fridge, and then his half-sister Sabrina shows up at one point, and he's describing how she's like eating a pecan pie and just piling up whipped cream on it like it's a freaking skyscraper.
Yeah.
And it seems like such a useless thing to talk about. Yeah, okay, so he's going down because he's got the munchies and he's going to the fridge. But then, of course, he meets her there and he's talking about stuff, and that's going to affect where the story goes. And so it's interesting. Keeps going back and forth.
And they're nice breaks in between the telling the story of the Gearys and Rachel and like, okay, now I need to stop here because there was a knock at my door, and Marietta came in, and there's a lot of little cool stuff like that.
And she's bringing in the cocaine and the booze, and I'm gonna go smoke a cigar with Lumen, and that's some of the things, especially the cigar part, that makes me feel like Maddox has a lot in common with Clive. But the first-person narrator, he was taking a major risk with his stylistic change. I mean, he did revisit this in Mr. Begone, though.
Yeah, well, and writing a romance novel. I mean, if people were upset that he broke away from the Books of Blood style, I mean, how did they feel about him making basically a romance novel? This is not really a horror novel at all.
Yeah, there are some terrific moments that happen, but for the most part,
but it's pretty tame by comparison to some other stuff.
I think I remember at the time some of the quotes that were put in promos and ads for this book mentioned something like a Barbara Cartland meets Hellraiser or something like that. I could see that a little bit. It's very romantic. Clive himself mentions that he himself was experiencing lots of romantic feelings in his relationship at the time. One
interesting sort of aside is that I for our news I have Google I have a Google save search for Clive Barker. And like 3/4 of the stuff that comes up is all people comparing something to Clive Barker. It's like, oh, that was so Clive Barker. Or, this reminded me of Clive Barker. And it's always sort of like Lovecraftian, scary stuff with monsters and coming out of the dark and tentacles. And it's like, that all seems pretty superficial. I think that it's kind of hard to define Clive Barker. I mean, we've spent 193 episodes now kind of trying to do that. So I think it's a little glib to just Yeah.
I mean, Clive himself is not a stranger to drinking off of certain, well-known artifices. I mean, for example, I mean, there's a universal theory of storytelling, I guess. One of the most common ones is the monomyth, which is basically also called the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true for this book. I mean, there's a certain degree of that here.
Well, and he's,
especially with Galilee.
And he's sort of revealed a major part of it in The Thief of Always, right? He said evil will always be undone by its own appetite.
Right.
And that, when you read that and then you go back to all of his stories, like, yeah, that's like every time. That's like every story.
Yeah, like there's, I think, at least a dozen stages for the hero's journey. And we see it repeated in this book. Not just with Galilee, but for example, with the story of Zalim. I think I think he's mentioned in like the second part. Right. Zalim, he's just a normal guy, but in a way, he kind of undergoes a little bit of the hero's journey himself, because it starts usually in the ordinary world, and then there's a call to adventure, which is when
this is like pre-Christ, right? This time of Zelim and the fishing village.
Yeah. I got that idea too, in this little village called Atva.
Yeah.
And I looked up Atva, though. There exists a village called Atva, but it's in Uzbekistan, and it's not by any sort of sea or shoreline at all. So let me see.
Well, and how close would that be to Samarkand?
You know what? I think I messed up. Hang on.
Okay.
I think... Okay, Atva is actually in Uttar Pradesh, and Samarkand is in Uzbekistan.
Oh.
And those two places, I looked them up here on Google Earth, they're like 1,500 miles apart.
Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if that Atva would be the Atva that Clive was thinking. I think it doesn't matter, really. It's just a little place by the sea, which I guess is another...
He says in the story that it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, in the Caspian Sea. So I don't think it could be Atva in Uttar Pradesh. But anyway, so yeah, like the monomyth starts with the hero at the ordinary world, right? And then there's a call to adventure. And that's what happens with Zalim. He's a fisherman. He's just talking to other fishermen, and one of them is being kind of rude. And so they get into a fight. And then he walks away from them, and he sees this couple coming out of the forest of the trees, right? Yeah. And that's, of course, Nicodemus and Caesarea or Caesarea or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But that's his call to adventure. And so in that sense, I think that you could make that argument. And even Maddox,
writing the book is his call to adventure.
He's kind of in the ordinary world. He's in the house, which is a house full of spirits and stuff. And it's interesting because Clive has brought this idea back for Abarat 2, I believe, because the house is kept because there was only like 6 people in the house, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, who's keeping this?
34,000 square foot.
34,000 square foot. Yeah. So there are these little kind of spirits and stuff that kind of do the chores around the house and do the maintenance.
Only when your back is turned, so you never see them.
Right. Yeah. And then Abarat 2, there's also these little spirits in the wind that kind of bring people news and let them know what's going on around the Abarat and stuff like that. And it's so weird, but it's at the same time it's such a I guess Clive Barker likes to do that, likes to bring this idea that the world itself is conscious at some level, and that there are these little wills that control what the world does when it's by itself. Yeah. So the world is not just a static thing; it's a living thing that has all these little powers in it that kind of keep things going. Yeah. So, and of course, after the call to adventure, usually there's the refusal of the call, and that happens, at Star Wars when like Luke, Luke wants to go adventure, but then he can't because he has to go get the moisture collector for the farm. But then, and he meets the mentor, which is Obi-Wan Kenobi. In this case, Zalim gets to meet, Nicodemus in Caesarea. And then he refuses to go into the forest because he tries to stay in his little village. But after he meets them, people are wary of Zelim, and they think that he was talking to demons and blah, blah, blah. So eventually he has to leave the village, and he decides to go to Samarkand because that's a place that his dad used to tell him all these stories. And of course, his dad never went to Samarkand, but he will eventually go there. And he does meet mentors along the way, and of course, goes through his ordeals and stuff. But in a lot of ways, this is the same thing. Like, the whole family is going into this crisis, and probably will get their victory, and then will become transformed, which is basically the hero's journey.
Well, the hero's journey is really kind of mainly reserved for fantasy novels. I mean, these days.
Right, that's true.
But I think Clive Barker's books are a sort of fantasy with horror mixed in, and they're modern day. So they're a little harder to identify that way, but I think that's kind of what they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you see Zelim moving from a place of tradition, boredom, into a place of flux and grandeur like Samarkand. And he becomes kind of like the storyteller, right? I mean, this episode marks him so much, meeting these divine creatures at the beach when they're about to baptize Galilee, their first son. He actually kind of makes a living off of telling this story to people, and then he starts becoming kind of a philosopher and he a thinker and all that. But at the end, his life is completely dominated by this chance encounter, and after he dies in Samarkand, his spirit actually goes with Galilee. Galilee shows up one night while Zelim is talking to his pupils, or the people who listen to him. And that night he passed away. And at the back of the room, he thinks he saw someone who might have been Galilee. I think it's really interesting that this whole long story of basically this guy that's like their ghost butler, it's almost like it's a short story in and of itself. It reads like a short story that Clive would write. That's a good point, because Zelim doesn't do much here. The only thing that he is brought into is to be the witness of Galilee's baptism.
Yeah.
But he is also part of the spirits that live at the L'Enfant, the house. And I think he still had a role to play. At the end of the book, his spirit shows up again and talks to Maddox and signals the arrival of Galilee to the house. Because that's... So yeah, I wonder how Galilee found him, if the whole story of his parents baptizing him eventually called him to Samarkand to meet Zelim, and that's an interesting idea. But yeah, it does sound like a short story that got put into this book.
A little bit.
Yeah,
I think that his story is interesting, and there's also kind of a little troubling part near the end. He had made. He'd made Caesarea promise to end him, to make him not exist.
Right. Which
is like, there's always this sort of dichotomy in Clive's stories of, there's this rich supernatural world of ghosts and spirits and afterlife. And then there's also like, when you die, you're just gone. There's nothing, and those always seem to be at odds with each other.
Or you go somewhere else where nobody else can find you, right? I mean, in the Magica, you go into the circle, and here, it's like there is a certain plane. There are spirits, but it seems like there's still another plane higher than that. So there's all these like little dimensions stacked on top of each other.
But Zeller, what he asked for was to just cease to exist, to just disappear. And he thought that would be wonderful. And it's like, but how will you know it's wonderful? You'll be just gone. There'll be nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? That's the problem with humans. We always think about, when I die, it's going to be great. I'm going to go to paradise. How do you know that?
Right,
Or
and
when
and
people
it's
think,
how can you imagine a world without you? You can't, right? Because I mean,
right, or
it's
it's
all
like, oh,
centered around your own consciousness.
or when people think that when they die they're just going to have eternal rest, and it's like,
Hmm.
well, rest implies a conscience.
Yeah,
Even when you're sleeping, you're not dead, you're still resting, you're still, your
yeah,
body is still alive and your mind is still going, doing something, you're dreaming at
yeah.
least.
That idea of like purgatory, of everybody just lying around in their graves waiting for the judgment day. That sounds horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. But so right, so Lumen is the guy who, after Caesarea tells Maddox that, yeah, I agree, you should write the book, you go see your brother Lumen. So that's how Maddox goes and meets Lumen. I think they haven't spoken in like years at this
Well, yeah,
point.
and he's no longer crippled because when Caesarea brought him to the dome, she also healed his back, and he's kind of like, well, would have you thank you, but it would have been nice if you'd done that 100 years ago.
Yeah. So the Dome of l'Enfant, and we can put this picture over at the show notes. There's a dome also at Monticello, the house that
Hmm.
Jefferson built, and you can see that what the dome would look like. And it looks like, of course, a dome vaulted
Yeah,
room. But
but then
when I
it,
read this book, I thought there was just one big skylight on top or something. But then I realized here, reading it again, it said, oh, there were like 9 openings. And I was like, what do you mean 9 openings? So I went and looked up the dome at Monticello, and I discovered, yeah, there are windows on all 8 sides. Again, the octagon
yeah,
of the dome. And then there's one on the top. So that's where the light is coming in. And it seems to be almost representative of a womb of sorts,
yeah,
because it's Caesarea's room. This is where, um, there's a lot of significance to this room. So when he goes there, the only person that he sees, the presence that visits him in the dome of l'Enfant, is Caesarea. But he sees Caesarea as kind of like a flashback, but at the same time, she's actually there. And I was particularly stricken by how wonderful Caesarea's first appearance is in this flashback, because we see kind of like, it's almost like a Maddox goes through the entire creation of the world in like a quick flashback. He sees like mountains and forests growing in front of him and animals coming and going and all that. And all of a sudden there's this big fire in the middle of the forest. And out of this fire that creates like this burning cathedral with all those giant trunks of trees burning, and
hmm,
this, and then all of a sudden Caesarea walks out of it, with breasts spurting milk, and a vagina that squirts blood.
yeah,
So complete image of uh, fertility and motherhood and femininity, like almost like one of those Neolithical fertility goddesses, right? That
yeah.
people used to make, the little with the big boobs and the little slit, and it's just this big fertility icon. And she's kind of like that, and she is so powerful in her presence that every time he sees Caesarea in person in this whole book, uh, his body responds to it. Like, right? Like
Yeah.
his body feels like a spurt of energy. He gets like, he feels like his pains go away. His body starts healing himself. And he also gets a major erection.
Yeah,
So,
he says that has to be milked for like 3 days or something.
yeah. So it's like she's a very, like you said, she's an ideal or an archetype of femininity.
Hmm.
So very, very interesting. That whole experience of him getting healed by the spirit of Caesarea, and then getting all the memories, just inhaling all those memories through his mouth and nose, and just blowing them out, and being able to remember everything as if he was there. It's just like it was his own memories.
Yeah.
So that's how he manages to write the book.
Right, and even stuff that maybe Caesarea or Nicodemus wouldn't remember, or stuff that's happening like right now, but with the Gearys.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And that burning forest, she tells Maddox, is where his father went to find her. So that's the only bit of information that we're given on how Nicodemus and Caesarea met, and it seems like they were just freshly created in the kind of like this almost Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And it seems like they met, and it's said in conversation with Caesarea throughout the book that he asks her, "Did you ever love my father?" And she's like, "Well, when two people as powerful as us got together, it was more about creating and giving birth to children more than love." Because I guess they're too different or opposed to actually love each other. I don't know.
It's interesting though, because she's also really jealous of him. So, she doesn't want him to have affairs, and
Right.
she resents Maddox. She had resented Maddox because he was,
and one of her big loves was Thomas Jefferson. That's
Yeah,
the
right.
man that I think she probably loved most of all men, was Thomas Jefferson. Of course.
But what was really interesting is he didn't really love her back. Which is strange, considering who she is and her power. That
Right.
he would just be like, I'm good, thanks.
Well, he had a country to build, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he had his own ambition, and
So driven, yeah.
if he had stayed with Caesarea, in comparison to her, he would probably not feel comfortable. He would always be, an underling to Caesarea. He would become probably so infatuated with her presence and her power that probably he would have to give up on his own ambitions.
Yeah, he would be a different person.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that, considering the way they are, that all of these children are children of the two of them together, of Nicodemus and Caesarea, right? Except for Edmund. He's the only one that's a half, brother to all of these.
Right. His mother was, what was the name of his mother? Let me check.
Oh,
it's right here.
Moira Feeney.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, everybody else is, and let's see, Moira Feeney.
Yeah.
Born in 1791, died 1811, and then Gisela Feeney, sister. I don't know why she's in the Barbarossa family tree. I guess we'll find that out.
Well, and over the course of the story, Moira, so she died young, and it seemed she had some kind of a disease, and it seemed kind of like maybe Nicodemus orchestrated her death, but it's not said outright. But then,
Right.
Then her sister Gisela said, "Oh, I don't want you anywhere near your, that father of yours.
Oh, that's right.
I'm gonna watch you from now on." And then she was mysteriously struck by lightning.
Yeah, mysteriously. He actually brings that up, suspiciously struck by lightning.
Yeah.
And that's when he went back to, I think Nicodemus got him back and brought him into the Barbarossa family again.
Yeah.
And those were the best years of his life. He was going to Paris, Venice, and all these places and experiencing all this life.
Looking at horses.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
and it's also interesting that that one sort of offhanded remark in this book is that these half breeds or demigods that are the result of children from any of these Barbarossas, if they don't know that they're divine, then they live out a normal human span and they live and die. But if they said knowing is as important as your blood.
Yeah, that's very Clive Barker.
Yeah, it is.
Where you may have power inside you, but unless someone unlocks it or you get some sort of revelation, you're never going to be able to tap into that.
Yeah.
And when you do, it changes your life forever. Yeah, so that's the Barbarossas. And when you go into the Giris, though, the Giris are very, it says here, some of the quotes that I saved from the book says, "For several generations, the Giris have behaved and been treated like a form of American royalty. And like royalty, they've always acted as though they were above the common law in both their private and their corporate dealings." So, in some ways, love was the ultimate manifestation of the Geary demon because love was the way the family increased itself, enriched itself. So that's true because a lot of powerful families, they add more to their fortune by marrying other rich families, and
Yeah.
sometimes, oh, my son should marry your daughter, and then we can both join our empires together, and then maybe some under the table dealings happen, and eventually they find a way to increase their richness like twofold. And also says here, there was no place of power in which he, Cadmus, was not known and lionized. He influenced the passing of bills and the election of judges. He bought Democrats and Republicans alike and left them at the mercy of their parties when he was done with them. I don't really go very political on the podcast, and I'll do my best not to do that, but it seems like he's talking about a certain person that I think we can imagine, because he is mentioned in this book. His name is mentioned in this book.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Rachel has an apartment in Trump Tower.
Yeah, Trump Tower.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And this is a place where lots of weird shit happens. Yeah. Some wild things happen in these apartments at Trump Tower. Yeah. And recently, the new San Francisco Bay Area magazine called The Fight published an interview with Clive Barker about the Folsom Street Fair that's going to happen this year. And in that interview, which was mind-blowing for me because I read this yesterday and I was like, holy crap. So they say there's a new book coming out called Imagining Man, and it's like a photo book that Clive Barker wants to publish of his own photographs. I don't know when that's coming out, but they mentioned that. And in another question, they asked him, in the current world of Trump, what do you think the LGBTQ community should be focused on and why? And Clive replied, this is a world in which all the structures which we as an aspiring civilized culture are trying to put in place are undermined. And the terrifying thing is it's happened so quickly. We now take for granted that Trump has told over 4,000 lies since he went into office. This is just part of the news cycle and is absolutely appalling. He's attempting to undermine our sense of what is real, and it's far worse than crazy. It is an assault upon our values and, of course, an assault upon democracy. We should stay focused on how our rights may be removed from us or diluted in these very difficult times. But we have a great deal to be thankful for. I grew up thinking that the thing I felt in myself as defining me, probably more than any other thing, my sexuality, was something I could never speak of, and I lived in terror of that through my childhood. So there you go. I mean, I don't remember Clive mentioning anything about any American administration ever. Oh, this is interesting.
I think he had talked about Bush before.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Right. So the Gearys are old money, and, they are pretty broken. In that sense, their ambition has distorted their family to the point where, Cadmus's grandkids, I think, they're just horrible people.
Yeah.
They're just horrible, murderous people. They just don't work. And especially Garrison. Garrison is, I think, the one character that would probably make the transition. He's going to become the villain of Galilee 2 if it ever gets written.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the story of how the Gearys became the family that they are is basically this cook from the Civil War, Nubs Nickelberry, ended up getting saving Galilee's life, and he's like, okay, well, you owe me now. And so Galilee spent years, as like we had talked about with the Magica, horror assassin, right? He had spent years doing whatever Nickelberry wanted, beating people up, murdering people. And Nickelberry didn't really have any time to make his wife happy, so that was also Galilee's job.
Right, and that's where the pact begins, where it's Galilee becomes he promises that he would always comfort the Geary women.
Yeah.
And in return, the Geary women made sure that he would never have to do anything else for the male part of the Geary family ever again.
Yeah.
But he's still connected to them.
That was Bedelia's dying wish or dying words, right? That Galilee would never have to do anything for the men ever again, and only for the women.
So at first, Maddox wants to write the story, and he tells Marietta that he has to bring in the Gearys into the story. And she hates that. She says, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Then I'm not going to help you make anything about it. But, of course, he has to bring in Rachel into the story. And that's like that she comes into the story really, really early. And she's just a waitress in a podunk town in Ohio. Probably someone who knows the name of the city in the novel is angry at me right now because I call it a podunk town. But so she's from Ohio. She's a waitress. She gets to meet Mitchell Geary.
Yeah.
That's him, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So
he's shopping for jewelry in her jewelry store.
Yeah, which is crazy. So it's this kind of nouveau riche aristocracy of sorts, and he seduces a waitress and eventually is going to marry her, and things are not going to go well, because as soon as she gets into that family, she starts realizing that they all hate each other, and basically they brought her in because they want a heir to the Geary family, and this is something she's at one moment seems like she's going to do it, but unfortunately, in part 3, called An Expensive Life, she ends up having a miscarriage. And at this point, she says that it seems like her body just did not want to generate a Geary.
Right, yeah, she feels guilty about it, and then she wonders if Mitchell senses her guilt or if he blames her. And it does really seem like at that moment, their relationship is just torn apart, and it's irreparable.
Yeah, it seems like marriage for the Gearys is more a convenience thing. It's not a marriage of love. Yeah. It's more like, hey, I'm giving you a good life. In return, I just want you to look away from my indiscretions. Let me live my life the way I want it. And you get to live in luxury in a gilded cage and give me a hair.
Yeah, make children.
Yeah, make children. And it's like, that's not what she wants. And that's obviously not rewarding for anybody emotionally or spiritually. So I think at this point, it's like one of the Geary women tells her that she could go to Hawaii and relax, and they hint that something special will happen there.
Yeah, I think Margie suggested it initially, right?
Yeah, and she pays dearly for that.
Yeah.
Margie is Garrison's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Rachel does go and visit Hawaii, and that's, of course, where she's going to meet Galilee.
And Margie was really the only likable Geary. I mean, she was kind of Rachel's ally in this, horrible family.
Right. And it doesn't last long because Garrison kills her. He kills his own wife.
Yeah, just because he wants to find a notebook.
Yeah. Spoilers.
Yeah. So
that notebook, I didn't read that part, but I think it was George. It was a guy called Holt, right?
Yeah, Commander Holt's journal.
Holt's journal.
Yeah, describes his experience in the war, and then meeting up with Nubs Nickelberry, and then their meeting with Galilee, which, Rachel gets this notebook from Margie, and she reads that. She's like, wait, Galilee? And she's like, oh, it can't be the same, Galilee.
Yeah.
This was 100 and some years ago.
And one of the 2 betrayals that Galilee did to his family under instruction of the Gearys, I think one of them was he told someone how to get to the house where the Barbarossas live, right?
He led because he was injured, and so he led Nickelberry and Holt to their house, and so Holt wrote it down in his journal.
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting because, of course, like you said, the Gearys are tired. They don't know exactly what their relationship with the Barbarossas is. I think that the story of their connection is kind of broken with Cadmus. Cadmus is like this really he's this guy who I think broke his entire family, right? He's such a poisonous, toxic person.
Yeah.
And I think he kept most of that knowledge to himself. So his
Yeah,
sons and
it was just like
grandsons,
you just do what I say, don't question it, or bad
right?
things will happen to you. But when he gets old and senile, nobody's threatened by him anymore, and now all of a sudden the families kind of can run rampant and do what they want.
Yeah. So in part 5, after Rachel goes to Hawaii and gets to meet Galilee, Cadmus has a stroke. He kind of strokes out. And that puts him in a situation where he knows that the end is coming. In the meantime, Rachel and Galilee end up making love on Hawaii, and we get another interesting story here. Like Galilee tells her a fable about this princess that meets this shiny, fish creature, right?
Yes, didn't it remind you of one of the stories from Tonight Again? The one with the little girl and the creature
Goes into the orchard.
from
Yeah.
across the wall. Yeah.
Right. It does remind me of that. And it also reminds me a little bit of the creatures that show up at the end of Imagica, and the waters, when the waters rise, right?
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, the Judith meets some of those women, and the goddesses bring forth the waters, and there's these shiny creatures that were mating with women and making babies, magic babies. So, yeah, an interesting story there. I mean, just that one little fable is actually something that's really, really pretty and beautiful. And how this princess meets this guy, and then she lays on the grass, and he's bit by a beetle, which represents, of course, death and decay. And then she gets sick, and the king doesn't know what's going on. And the creature comes out of the river, but every step it takes from the river, it gets smaller and weaker, until he's just this weird, like, pallid, shadowy creature.
Right.
And eventually he just falls on top of her and crashes like a wave and heals all the boils that she has.
Yeah. And that would have been a good ending for the story, but then it goes on and gets really strange that the father, wants to set up a church in the banks of the river to honor this creature that saved his daughter, and everybody in the church ends up getting killed.
Yeah, because they want to make the baptismal fountain. They want it to be fed by the waters of the river. But I don't know what sort of plumbing they got, man. But the plumber did a horrible job, because
right.
The first time they put the pipes to work, that baptismal font just explodes, and it kills the king with a giant slab of rock, and kills everybody in the church, and then it crashes everything. So I guess it is a weird ending there. But I wonder how much of this story is kind of trying to mirror Galilee healing all the Geary women with his love.
Yeah.
And then the Geary family trying to harness that power and getting destroyed in the process.
Right. Yeah. It's like when people, revere something, they want to figure out how they can control it. Yeah. And maybe that's
a good point.
That's where what he's getting at. It's interesting though. That's another one of those that, could be one of his short stories.
Yeah. So eventually, Margie gets murdered by Garrison. Garrison's a horrible guy. Like, he likes to go to Trump Tower and have sex with prostitutes that are lying on a bed of ice and pretend like they're dead corpses and stuff like that. So it's really weird, creepy shit going on here.
Yeah.
He's kind of like the Death Boy in a way from Great and Secret Show.
He does remind me of that.
He's kind of like a dead inside kind of guy.
He feels ashamed when it's over, but then there's a point where he doesn't anymore, and then that's like, okay, now you've passed the point of you're not redeemable anymore.
He kind of gets proud of being able to do these nasty things at some point. Yeah. It's really, really creepy.
Yeah, and he's one of those people that thinks because he has money, he can do whatever he wants.
Yep. And like I said, Trump in this book is absent, but he's represented by his... by the idea of a mammon-glorifying nouveau riche American aristocracy that has their roots deep into dark, moist, rotten stuff. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Trump Tower itself is kind of a phallus-looking thing. So there is that. And So yeah, so there's also a bordello in that flashback um, of Nub Nickelberry and Galilee and stuff. Galilee at one point was a pimp.
Hmm.
He's had all these sort of lives, so he's had more lives than anybody could fit in his span, which is extensive. But he still looks young, right? He looks like he's
Yeah.
in his 40s.
Yeah. And so, in your second reading of this book, did you like it better this time around, or did you feel the same?
I liked it better. Yeah, I did. I mean, I liked it better, but I also had a more context for a lot of stuff that happens in the book. I had some context, and I was drawing these parallels, and I was like,
Yeah.
I could see why Clive would make a book like this. He was trying to get away from that whole, you know, horror reputation that he had. And I also read the chapter about this book in the Dark Fantastic,
Oh yeah.
and it's on page 443. It's chapter 30, and Douglas Winter talks about. He makes also these parallels between what was going on with Clive's life and stuff, and how Clive in this book explains his intention when he writes is that one of the things that Maddox says is, in my heart, I realize I want most of all to romance you, to share with you a vision of the world that puts order where there has been discordance and chaos. Nothing happens carelessly. We're not brought into the world without reason, even though we may never understand that reason. An infant that lives an hour, that dies before it can ever lay eyes on those who made it, even that soul did not live without purpose. This is my sudden certainty, and it is my duty to sweat until I convince you of the same. And he mentions here that he thinks that this is Clive telling us what he thinks that writing is like for him.
Yeah.
Um,
In a feverish
that's
attempt, what is it? What is that line? If in a feverish attempt to imitate the creator,
oh yeah,
men
I
are
am a
men.
man and men are animals who tell stories.
Yeah, yeah. It's that
Yeah,
that idea that you're always going to be trying to reach perfection, which is perfection is the idea that's in your head,
yeah,
but
emulate
it's always
our
going to be
creator.
imperfect when you put it out into the world.
Right, right, and in doing so, understand why we were born.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so there's I really recommend reading this chapter because he talks about the story a little bit and talks about all these things that says here. By the time the manuscript of the novel was complete, its epic romance was paralleled by the secure and fulfilling love that Clive had found in his own life with his own Galilee David Armstrong. And he
Yeah.
said, it was very obvious very quickly that this person was changing my life at an incredible rate, and that he was doing it by the sheer force of who he was. And here I was telling the story about a person who seems to have her life all set up, and then it turns into a different thing because of the presence of this man. So it's Rachel's life and how it
Yeah.
gets changed. I was feeling all these things I had never felt before, and I knew they were stuff of romance in a very obvious way. Nothing ironic about it. And he goes on to talk about his depression and stuff, and then says that there's no moment when you're with David when you are not with David. When you are not with David, that's just who he is. And he woke me up. He slapped me and he woke me up and he said, "Be with me. Don't be with some other place. Be with me. You're with me. Be with me." So Clive was coming out of this deep depression that he wrote Chiliad, and he fell in love, and it changed his life. And I think this is one of Clive's last stands in trying to come up with a novel that would crystallize this notion for him, of
Yeah.
this domestic life. Even Galilee at the end wants to have kids and fill up the whole house with the patter of little feet, right? And Clive got a neat little package, which was a husband and a daughter,
Yeah.
and he had to learn how to raise a child and all that. So, like you can find that out if you read the Dark Fantastic. That Clive was never much into the whole domestic marriage family thing, but when he got into it, he actually felt this motivation, right? That kind of dragged him out of this depression that he was in.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. It's really a hopeful book, and for his life and everything, and it. We don't know where this is going to go if Galilee will have a sequel.
Right. Did you ever think about what you could see the story going into for Galilee 2?
No, I mean he has it all. He had said he had it all mapped out, but All I know is that Garrison was on his way to L'Enfant, and that's it, right? Somehow that's going to undo their lives, but I don't know how. You'd think that the traps, that are there would stop him, but
Right, that a
yeah,
pack of hyenas is going to show up at some point.
yeah, right,
Because at the beginning, we hear that I think it was Marietta. She brought 3 hyena pups to L'Enfant like decades ago, and then got bored and let them loose in the forest, in the swamp, and then they kind of bred incestuously, and now there was a big pack of hyenas somewhere out there.
yeah.
So weird thing for Clive to include. I think there might be a payoff for that. Here's what I think Galilee 2 would move towards. I think that Galilee and Rachel will have a child. I think that the whole setup of her being unable to give the Gearys an heir seems to indicate that she will probably get pregnant with a Barbarossa.
Yeah.
Even when they say that she can't have kids anymore, I think that's not going to be true. I think she's going to have a child.
She's got a magical, husband, so.
Yeah, magical sperm.
Yeah, right.
And this is going to unite the two families legally, if not by blood. And I think Loretta will have a role to play in blocking Garrison's action to track down L'Enfant and destroy the Barbarossas. I think that Loretta could be the one who ends the war at some point. I would like to see that because the Geary women seem to want to stop the Geary men from destroying the goodness in the world.
But Garrison could also end up killing Loretta.
That's true. Yeah.
And Loretta's not super nice either because she's the one that led that tipped Mitchell off about where the house is and where Rachel went.
Right. And then Mitchell goes there.
Yeah, and he killed Nia Lumpua, which that actually is one of my biggest gripes about this book is that Galilee doesn't take any time at all to mourn his son. His son that he's had for over 100 years.
Right, but they have a complex relationship, right? I mean, I get the feeling that Neolopua is resentful towards the Geary family, but at the same time, I think he has a hard time respecting his father because of what he sees him reduced to.
Right. It's
right. Yeah. And I think that Galilee is not a very good father either. He probably wasn't there for most of his son's life. So that's true. It's true. He doesn't really mourn his son that much.
He doesn't. I don't think he does at all. I mean, he just talks about Rachel, are you okay? And this is what we have to do next. We should leave. But there's no like, oh no, my poor son.
Right. Nilapua actually almost didn't have to exist in the story because he's just there to be the caretaker of the house. But I think, So, like you said, he could kill Loretta as well. I mean, the Geary men treat their own feminine side of the family as a commodity, right? As something to be placated as long as they provide the bloodline with heirs.
Right.
Garrison, on the other hand, he's kind of barren as a man. He loves death. He even pretends to have sex with dead women. So,
and he's sort of turned a corner where he doesn't care about what the public thinks anymore. He's just going to do whatever he wants, and he doesn't care about political maneuvering anymore. He's just become dangerous and uncontrollable.
I don't know what role Nicodemus or his spirit will have to play in Galilee 2.
Yeah, that's the other part.
I think he'll be back. His grave is mentioned as having mushrooms growing out of it, which Maddox describes as little phalluses. So I would like to imagine someone will eat one of those and maybe something magical will happen. I don't know. I don't think Nicodemus will reappear physically, but I think he will definitely have a word to say in all of this.
Yeah.
I think that Galilee needs to get redemption not just from his mother, but also from his father, because we didn't approach this, but the whole episode of Nicodemus's death is just hinted at here and there. But what happened was that Galilee turned on his I guess he helped his parent. He helped the Gearys somehow kill his father, right? There was some sort of weird thing that happened, and the horses trampled.
Did Galilee have something to do with that? I thought that they were just. I thought that just the storm was caused by Caesarea.
Yeah, Caesarea thinks that he had something to do with it. I remember reading something about that. That he helped. He turned. He got on the Geary side on the night that his dad died, and the way Nicodemus died was he got trampled by his horses.
Yeah.
And that's how Maddox got crippled, right?
Yeah, and his wife Chiojo got killed by the horses also.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'd imagine that Nicodemus will have something to say, even because Caesarea does say that he will return. I mean, there's some sort of throwaway line in there that says that Caesarea is waiting for Nicodemus's return. I remember reading.
Yeah, like she's been sitting by her window for hundreds of years, just waiting for him to come back.
And we've seen clearly that spirits like Zalim's spirit are present and interact with the Barbarossas at least. So death is just another stage in existence.
Right.
So, and I guess I could see Garrison is going to try to destroy to find his way to L'Enfant, and I don't know exactly what would happen. So this is kind of a weird spot that he leaves us in. There's also like Lumen's kids. Lumen has 3 children that Maddox is on his way out to find now, because Maddox leaves the house at the end of the book. He goes on the road, just like Zalim. He goes into the forest. So we'll see what happens there.
His kids are Jessamine, Truscott, and Kenneth.
Yeah. So, but yeah, very, very interesting, interesting story. It's not as self-contained as The Great and Secret Show. Definitely a lot of stuff was set up, and I would like to see a payoff of it.
No, I didn't feel that way. I felt it was about the same, as The Great and Secret Show. Both of those I wanted to see sequels to.
Okay. Let's see what Clive has to say about Galilee 2. It says here, as the Galilee mythology has emerged as a pair rather than a trilogy of volumes, it may mean that the conclusion of the Barbarossa versus Geary conflict will be easier to finish than the art was. Volume 2 was plotted at the same time as Volume 1 and was at one stage something of a priority to be written while it was still fresh. Now, though, along with the art Volume number 3, it's one of the books planned for after the Abarat series.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I don't think we're ever going to see this, because I don't know when Clive's going to finish Abarat.
He still has 2 more books to go.
Yeah, like the 4th one and the 5th one.
Yeah.
And he's still having trouble with the 4th one, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah, so Clive at the time mentioned that he expected them to be 2 700-page books, and it would take place in New York, Hawaii, Japan, Hollywood, Charleston, and Bentonville. I think we don't see anything in Japan and Bentonville in this book, so I guess that's where he wanted things to go.
So we will probably learn more about Chiojo.
Yeah, because that was Maddox's wife. So maybe he would go to Japan and do something there. I don't know. Maybe, yeah. So he wrote this book around 97, I think. He was working on it during an interview, and he's doing the final draft in the 97. So yeah, so what ideas do you have that you would like to see in the second book?
I try not to have expectations, because I think that with Clive Barker, if you start trying to predict or expect what's going to come, it's always different from what you expect. But yeah, right. I liked your idea that they would have a child. It does make sense. I think thematically, it does seem like they would have a kid.
Yeah.
I think that. I also kind of agree that I think that Garrison would become the main villain, because I think that it almost seems like what is her name? Not Kitty. Loretta. It seems like Loretta is sort of part villain, but she's just trying to look out for herself, because she's in a world where where her stepchildren are going to be plotting against her if she doesn't do something.
Yeah, and she knows that her grandchildren are not the best people in the world either.
Right. So when Mitchell demands to know where Rachel went, she has to say, because she's afraid of, she needs to make allegiances, and if she doesn't ally herself with Mitchell against Garrison, then she's going to have a hard time.
Right. At some point, I wonder if this was ever really like a story that needs an ending, because I don't know. It's just, it seems like the way that they end, in some ways, you can just kind of finish it in your head.
Yeah. Yeah, and
but,
I think that was true of Cabal, and even though Cabal was meant to be a trilogy, and it was true of the Great and Secret Show, and maybe not so much Everville, because once you get 2 books, you're like, all right, now you got to finish it.
Yeah, it's an ambitious novel for sure. It's very epic in scope, and unfortunately, another reason I think this book is never going to get finished is not just because it was planned to be so after the Aberrat series is completed, but also because I think that this is connected to a part of Clive's life and emotional life that he no longer feels a connection with. So I think it would be in some ways painful and in some ways disappointing for him to go back to this. And that's disappointing to me, I guess, because I don't like the idea of love falling out of love and letting love fester and turn into something else.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like that happens a lot with certain relationships where people respect each other and they love each other, but then when things go sour, it's spoiled forever, and there's never going to be any tenderness after that. There's only going to be at best a complete absence, a complete forgetfulness of that episode.
Howie and Joe Beth, right? I mean, they were like the two, the two lovers that you were rooting for in the Great and Secret Show, and then their love gets just spoiled and becomes something sort of septic, and she's sleeping with her twin brother and just crazy stuff.
So David and Clive's relationship ended up in a pretty spectacular way, very public, and that was unfortunate. But I don't know what Clive sees. What's his outlook on relationships now?
Yeah, and would he change his outline to more match the way he feels now, or would he try to finish it the way he originally intended?
And Clive is going to be one of those people. He's never going to retire. He's always going to be working until the day that he passes. But I just want to know that I would be okay with Clive retiring at some point if I knew that it was a happy retirement. That it's like, no, I just do what I want, and I'm happy, and I got people who love me, and I am happy doing the things I do, and I'm happy living in this house. And I just want him to have that security, to have that happy retirement. But I know he's very driven, and he still wants to finish Aberrat. That's very important for him because it's kind of like his Lord of the Rings. That's the thing that he put all of his effort after. After Imagica, I would say his largest and most ambitious and more meaningful piece of work is the Aberrat book, series of books, and the paintings, because that's been the driving force for him throughout all these years. He was working on Aberrat when he wrote this book, and he's still working on Aberrat now. It's 2018, and
I know, and at some point we're gonna have to get to the Aberrat books. But I just keep thinking, well, maybe when 4 comes out, that'll be a good time for us to start. Maybe visit Aberrat, the first one, and
sure. Yeah. I mean, that's still something we have to do. We have not touched Aberrat, and the podcast, so I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, I didn't want to get too much into the story for Galilee because I feel like this is a book that you have to experience on your own. I hope that our little insight and little contextualization of certain episodes of the book story might have been useful for the people listening to the podcast. And I encourage you to go read Galilee,
or reread it if you haven't visited. Although, like, a lot of us probably didn't read it since it was published in '98, so it's really worth going back to.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, read, and Mr. Begone was the other book that came out after this that also had the first person narration, and
Yeah.
and that was kind of it for Clive Barker. I mean, after Mr. Begone, was there any new stuff that came out afterwards apart from the Abarat books? It was Abarat 3, I guess.
Yeah, Cold Heart Canyon.
Oh yeah, Cold Heart Canyon. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Galilee, Cold Heart Canyon, Abarat 1, then Mr. Begone, then Abarat 2, and Abarat 3.
Yeah. And Cold Heart Canyon is also, again, going back to this idea of the canyons of LA, the landscape of LA, which is something that Clive is living on. So it started becoming a little more, focused on his own experience of living in LA and living in that house in LA and going into a world of his own inside that house in LA, which also happens in Cold Heart Canyon, right? The mural that gets transported into the house, and then it's the doorway where things happen. And
and when I first read Cold Heart Canyon, and I've only read it once, it gave me this feeling of negativity, and anger.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how I remember Clive's books, and I that bothered me. I didn't like it. But I'll be interested to go back to it, when we get to it. Maybe we will be able to still do that this year.
Yeah, and that actor that wants to stay young, right? And he wants to stay young and goes under the knife and things go horribly wrong. And he becomes a recluse. And at one point he tries to bury himself in his own bed with a pile of dirt because he's in this state of undeath. He doesn't want to come back to the world. He feels like, people are going to judge him for what he looks like now or judge him for what his current condition is. Yeah. And so he stays in that house and he tries burying himself with a pile of dirt. And he never leaves. So anyway, so that's Galilee.
Yeah.
That's Galilee. Amazing book, especially the Barbarossa stories and the sections of them. Powerful characters all around. And it's just a shame we never got to see the second part. But
it may still happen, but we don't. With Clive, I think we've said this before, but it's best to just kind of ride the waves and take what comes and don't try to anticipate too much.
Yeah, it's a fun exercise though. So
yeah.
Alrighty.
Okay, we'll end this podcast having no beginning, will have no end. You can find the show notes for this episode and join the discussion over at www.clivebarkercast.com, where we have news, features, reviews, and links to all the ways you can connect with us. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and every other place you can find podcasts. Clive Barker Podcast, or BarkerCast, is an independent editorial, podcast, and news blog that is not affiliated with or under contract by Clive Barker or Seraphim Inc. This is a labor of love by the fans for the fans.
Thanks for listening.